Jack Carter's head throbbed as he slowly regained consciousness, the stale, metallic scent of recycled air filling his nostrils. His arms were bound, his wrists chafed from whatever crude restraints his captors had used. He cracked one eye open, just enough to take in his surroundings without alerting anyone that he was awake. The dim overhead lighting flickered, casting jagged shadows across the cold, gray walls. The air vibrated with a deep, guttural chuckling. "You see, human, this is where your kind belongs," one of the reptilian aliens sneered, his scaly lips pulling back to reveal sharp, needle-like teeth. "In chains." Jack blinked, pretending to be more disoriented than he was. His training kicked in immediately. Analyze, assess, exploit. He counted 3 slavers standing over him, their postures relaxed, cocky. More laughter echoed from outside his cell, where a handful of others stood, watching like spectators at a blood sport. They thought he was weak. Good. That would make this easier. One of them, taller than the others and wearing a crude leather strap across his chest, leaned down, gripping Jack's chin roughly. His breath reeked of old meat. "You're lucky. Most humans scream when they wake up here. They know what happens next." Jack's gaze was flat, unreadable. "What happens next?" The slaver chuckled again. "You'll fetch a good price. Humans are rare, and the rich ones out there love having pets who can talk." Another slaver snorted. "Not this one. He looks too scrawny. Maybe we should just gut him and sell the meat." Jack remained silent, suppressing the grin threatening to tug at his lips. Let them talk. Let them think they had him figured out. He was already calculating his next move. A high-pitched beep sounded from a console outside the cell. One of the slavers lazily tapped at the interface, his amusement quickly fading as an alert flashed across the screen. His narrow pupils widened. Boss?" the slaver muttered. This can't be right." The one gripping Jack's chin frowned. "What?" The nervous one gestured at the screen, gulping audibly. "His file just updated. It's pulling from a classified human military database." His throat bobbed again. "This human isn't just anyone. His call sign is Reaper." The others exchanged looks, but Jack saw what he was waiting for, the split-second shift from arrogance to doubt. One of them scoffed, trying to mask his unease. "So what? It's just a name." The nervous one shook his head. "No, you don't get it. Reaper is a ghost story. The humans tell it to scare their enemies. They say one soldier, one man, took out an entire insurgent fleet alone. It's classified, but the rumors say he was too dangerous even for his own kind." Silence hung in the air, thick with tension. Jack tilted his head slightly, letting a slow, almost lazy smirk cross his face. "So, now what happens?" The biggest slaver scoffed, shaking off the nerves. "Doesn't matter. You're still in a cage. You're still going to be sold." Jack's smirk widened. "You sure about that?" The slaver's grip on his chin tightened for a fraction of a second before he let go and turned away with a scoff. "Put him under heavy guard. No one touches him until we reach the market." As the guards filed out, Jack exhaled slowly, testing the tension in his restraints. They'd made a mistake. They had looked at his file, they had seen his name, and yet they still thought they could keep him contained. That meant they were either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. He was betting on the latter. Jack spent the next few hours in silence, sitting still, listening. He heard their laughter from down the hall, the casual conversations in a language he had already begun to decipher. The ship wasn't well guarded, probably because they hadn't needed to worry before. They didn't see humans as a threat. That was going to change. 2 guards stood watch outside his cell, their backs to him. One of them yawned. "I don't know why everyone's so scared," the guard muttered. "He's just sitting there." "Yeah, well," the other replied, shifting uncomfortably. "Boss says to keep the blasters ready, just in case." Jack sighed dramatically, drawing their attention. "You know," he said, voice casual, "you're making a mistake." The first guard turned, sneering. "Oh yeah? What mistake is that?" Jack leaned back, letting his smirk return. Not running while you had the chance. The first guard laughed. Big words for a guy in chains. Jack shrugged. If you say so. At that moment, the ship rocked slightly, a minor tremor, but enough to make the lights flicker. The guards barely noticed. Jack did. It meant they were adjusting course, maybe nearing their destination. He didn't have much time. Jack rolled his shoulders slightly, letting his body relax. You ever hear of a guy named Blackburn? He asked. The second guard frowned. Who? Jack let his smirk widen. Exactly. He thought he had me locked up, too. The guards exchanged nervous glances. And then Jack moved. He shifted his weight just enough to snap the restraints loose, because while the slavers had been busy laughing at their prize, he had been subtly working at them, loosening the joints just enough. By the time the first guard even reached for his weapon, Jack was already there, twisting the blaster out of his grip and driving an elbow into his throat. The second guard barely got a yell out before Jack flipped him into the cell bars, knocking him unconscious. Jack exhaled, adjusting the stolen blaster in his hands. Outside, the slavers were still laughing, unaware that everything had just changed. Jack flexed his fingers, rolling out his shoulders, then took his first step forward. Time to get to work. Jack Carter crouched low against the bulkhead, listening to the fading footsteps of a passing patrol. The stolen blaster in his hands felt reassuringly solid, but he knew it wouldn't last. Ammunition was limited, and he had no illusions about surviving a prolonged shootout. He needed to move fast, stay ahead of the panic, and turn this ship into his hunting ground before the slavers even realized they weren't in control anymore. He had spent years infiltrating enemy bases, ghosting through hostile environments, and eliminating high-value targets. This was no different, except this time, he wasn't just dismantling an enemy force. He was sending a message. Jack took a deep breath and peeked around the corner. The hallway was clear, dimly lit by flickering emergency lights. His escape had already triggered an alert, but the slavers had yet to pinpoint his location. That was good. It meant they were disorganized. And disorganized enemies were easy to pick apart. He moved quickly, staying close to the walls. The ship was larger than he had anticipated, but the layout was surprisingly simple, functional, built for efficiency rather than defense. Most of the corridors fed into a central loading bay, where he assumed they stored their cargo before transport. If he could reach it, he might find supplies, weapons, or even other captives. His instincts told him he wasn't alone in this fight. Up ahead, he spotted a control panel embedded in the wall. He knelt beside it, examining the interface. The language was alien, but he had seen enough variations of similar systems to understand the basics. He tapped into the ship's security feed, scanning through camera angles until he found what he was looking for. The bridge was on high alert, several slavers shouting, weapons drawn, scrambling to secure key locations. They weren't searching methodically. They were reacting. They were afraid. Jack allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Good. Then, something else caught his eye. A group of prisoners huddled in a cell deeper in the ship, guarded by only 2 slavers. Jack's smile disappeared. He had planned to focus solely on escape, but now? That wasn't an option anymore. Jack adjusted his grip on the blaster and rose to his feet. It was time to expand the mission. The slaver guarding the cell barely had time to register Jack's presence before he dropped. A single, silent shot to the head. His partner turned, mouth open to shout, too late. Jack was already on him, wrapping an arm around his throat and driving him backward into the wall. The alien struggled, clawing at Jack's arm, but the fight was brief. Jack tightened his grip until the body went limp, then let him slump to the floor. The prisoners inside the cell stared, wide-eyed. They were a mix of species, humans, a few humanoid aliens, and one creature that looked like a sentient pile of rocks. Jack wasted no time. He grabbed the keycard from the dead slaver's belt and swiped it across the lock. The door hissed open. A young human woman stepped forward cautiously. Are you with the resistance? Jack shook his head. No. I'm just pissed off. One of the other prisoners, a grizzled-looking man with a scar down his face, studied Jack, his eyes narrowing. You're the one they were talking about. The human they captured. Jack gave a single nod. Not anymore. The scarred man grinned. I like you already? Jack quickly outlined the situation. They didn't have time for a slow, sneaky escape. Now that he had freed the prisoners, the slavers would realize they had a full-blown rebellion on their hands. The ship's security would tighten fast. We need weapons, the scarred man said. Jack tossed him the second blaster he had lifted off a guard. Then let's go shopping. They moved as a unit now, with Jack leading the way. The freed prisoners were rough but capable, sticking close and following orders without hesitation. As they worked their way through the ship, Jack took down enemies with lethal efficiency, his newfound allies grabbing weapons and gear from the fallen. The ship was turning into a battlefield, alarms blaring, slavers shouting commands that grew more frantic with every passing moment. Jack ducked behind a crate as a group of slavers charged down the hall ahead of them, weapons raised. He motioned for the others to stay back, then leaned out and fired, once, twice, 3 times. The first 2 slavers dropped instantly, the third stumbling back before Jack closed the distance and slammed his rifle butt into the alien's skull. More enemies were coming. He could hear them. Jack turned to his new squad. We need to hit them where it hurts. If we take the engine room, they'll be forced to surrender or die in space. The scarred man grinned again. You really don't mess around, do you? Jack just checked his ammo. Let's move. The engine room was heavily guarded. The slavers had realized by now that this wasn't just a standard breakout, this was an extermination. Jack and his team had carved a bloody path through the ship, and their enemies were beginning to break under the pressure. But the ones guarding the core? They were different. They didn't panic. They didn't shout. They just took position and prepared for a fight. Jack respected that. Didn't mean they were getting out alive. He signaled the others to spread out, flanking from different angles. The fight erupted in an instant, a hail of plasma fire cutting through the dimly lit room. Jack moved fast, ducking low, returning fire with deadly precision. One of the prisoners took a hit and went down. Jack barely registered it. He couldn't afford to. The battle was brutal, chaotic, and short. When the last slaver fell, silence settled over the room. Jack strode to the control panel and accessed the ship's command systems. He locked down all external communications, disabled the hyperdrive, and cut off every possible escape route. The slavers had nowhere left to run. He turned to the others. We just became the new captains of this ship. The scarred man let out a low whistle. Damn. What now? Jack glanced at the security feed. The remaining slavers were scattered, leaderless. A slow grin spread across his face. Now, he said, we hunt. Jack Carter stood in the center of the engine room, watching the security feed cycle through different parts of the ship. The remaining slavers were panicked, huddling in small groups, whispering frantically over their comms. He could see it in their body language. Their fight was gone. They were just trying to survive now. He wasn't going to let them. Jack turned to his newly freed allies, their faces lit by the flickering glow of the control panels. They had fought well. Some had military training, others had simply been desperate, but now they all had a choice. We take the bridge, Jack said. His voice was steady, confident, the kind of voice that made people believe in impossible victories. Once we control it, we control everything. Anyone who surrenders gets locked up. Anyone who fights? He let the question hang. They all knew the answer. The scarred man, Garrick, Jack had learned, grinned and checked his blaster. I like the way you think, Reaper. A wiry alien woman with 4 arms cracked her knuckles. Let's finish this. Jack nodded. No speeches. No rallying cries. Just action. The hunt was on. The march to the bridge was surgical. Jack moved like a shadow, his team following close behind. The slavers who hadn't fled outright made a last, desperate stand in the corridors leading up to the command deck, but it was over before it started. A pair of guards tried to ambush them at a corner. Jack dropped them before they even had a chance to fire. Another slaver, shaking so badly he could barely hold his weapon, surrendered without a fight. By the time they reached the final blast doors sealing off the bridge, the outcome was already decided. Jack motioned for the others to cover him as he accessed the control panel. The ship's security was basic, laughably so. These slavers had been living off fear and arrogance for so long that they'd forgotten how to prepare for a real threat. The doors slid open with a hiss. Inside, the bridge was eerily quiet. A half-dozen slavers stood frozen at their stations, their captain seated in the center, staring straight at Jack. The captain was bigger than the others, his deep green scales marked with old scars. His eyes flicked to the bodies littering the hallway behind Jack, then back to the blaster in his hand. "You don't have to do this," the captain said, voice steady despite the situation. "We can make a deal." Jack stepped forward, weapon lowered but not holstered. "You're assuming you have something I want." The captain smirked. "You want freedom. I can get you off this ship, undetected. No more running. No more fighting. Just a clean exit." Jack exhaled slowly. He could feel the others watching him, waiting for his move. He took another step, closing the distance. "You think I'm running?" Jack asked. The captain's smirk faltered. Jack moved fast. Before the captain could react, Jack grabbed him by the collar and slammed him down onto the control panel. The other slavers scrambled back, hands raised in surrender. "You and your crew are done," Jack said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You're going into the cells you put your prisoners in. Then we're sending out a message. Every slaver, every buyer, every scumbag in this network is going to know what happens when they try to take humans." The captain tried to snarl, but Jack shoved him harder against the controls, making him grunt in pain. "You're making a mistake," the captain rasped. "The black market isn't just some backwater operation. It's a galaxy-spanning empire. You think they'll let you live after this?" Jack leaned in, voice cold. "Let them try." The captain's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He knew it was over. Jack turned to his team. "Lock them up." Garrick grinned. "With pleasure." Jack stood at the ship's communication terminal, staring at the encrypted frequencies used by the slavers to coordinate sales and shipments. This was the heart of their operation, their lifeline to the rest of the criminal underworld. He activated the ship-wide broadcast. "This is Jack Carter," he said, voice steady and calm. "You know me as Reaper." He let that sink in for a moment before continuing. "The slavers running this operation are no longer in charge. Their prisoners are free. Their ship belongs to us now." He switched the camera feed, letting it show the defeated slaver captain and his crew, bound and caged like the people they had trafficked. "This is what happens when you come for humans." Jack ended the transmission. For a moment, there was silence. Then one of the former prisoners chuckled. Another let out a cheer. Jack turned to Garrick. "You said you knew a place where we could offload these bastards?" Garrick smirked. "Yeah. I know some people who'll be real interested in collecting bounties on slavers." Jack nodded. "Then set a course." The ship rumbled beneath them as the new crew took their places at the controls. Jack leaned against the console, arms crossed. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But tonight the slavers had learned something important. They weren't the hunters anymore. The Reaper was coming for them. The slaver ship docked at the black market station under false credentials, its transmission codes still valid despite the violent change in ownership. Jack Carter stood in the shadows of the cargo bay, his new crew gathered around him. Garrick, the grizzled ex-prisoner, leaned against the crate, casually checking the power cell on his blaster. The four-armed alien woman, Rin, adjusted the straps on her newly acquired tactical vest, her two lower arms gripping stolen weapons. The others, a ragtag group of freed captives, looked to Jack for leadership. Jack had studied the black market's operations through the ship's database. It was a sprawling station, orbiting a dying red star, filled with warlords, criminals, and slavers who thrived in the lawless fringes of the galaxy. If they suspected an ambush, they'd kill first and ask questions later. Jack tapped the side of his ear, activating a private comm link to Garrick. "We're walking into a nest of vipers. Keep it casual, but stay sharp." Garrick grinned. "Oh, I love a good viper's nest." The cargo bay doors hissed open. A wave of stale, recycled air hit them as the market's landing authorities signaled their clearance. The slaver's ship had been expected to deliver new merchandise. Instead, Jack and his crew were bringing something else: death. A welcoming party awaited them at the dock. A group of heavily armed mercenaries, their armor dented and mismatched, stood in formation as a thin, pale-skinned alien with elongated fingers and sharp, black eyes stepped forward. "You're late," the alien said, his voice smooth and amused. "And your ship's transponder is broadcasting some rather conflicting signals." Jack gave a small, humorless smile. "New management." The alien's black eyes narrowed slightly, and his gaze flicked toward Jack's crew. The other mercenaries tensed, hands twitching toward their weapons. Jack exhaled. It was always going to come to this. Faster than the mercenaries could react, Jack drew his blaster and fired. The first shot took the leader between the eyes, dropping him before he could speak. Chaos erupted as Jack's crew opened fire, scattering the remaining guards before they could mount a defense. The black market was a den of criminals and killers, but none of them were ready for Reaper. The corridors of the station erupted in gunfire and screams. Jack moved through the chaos like a ghost, eliminating slavers and mercenaries with ruthless efficiency. Every shot was precise, every movement calculated. He had fought in wars, dismantled insurgencies, and taken down high-value targets. This was just another mission. Rain covered his flank, her 4 arms allowing her to fire in 2 directions at once, while Garrick and the others pushed forward, cutting a bloody path through the market's security. A group of slavers tried to regroup near a bulkhead, but Jack tossed a stolen stun grenade into their midst, watching with satisfaction as they collapsed in convulsing heaps. As they advanced, Jack tapped into the station's control systems using an interface near a locked security door. He bypassed the primitive firewalls, accessing the mainframe. The market's buyer list, transaction records, and delivery routes all flashed before his eyes. Names. Faces. Locations. This wasn't just a single black market hub. It was part of a much larger operation, spanning multiple systems, trafficking countless lives. Jack didn't just want to take down this station. He wanted to send a message to every slaver in the galaxy. He activated the station-wide broadcast system. "Attention, slavers," Jack said, his voice echoing through the market's intercoms. "This is Reaper." Panic rippled through the marketplace as his name rang out. He could hear shouting, weapons being drawn, criminals scattering like cockroaches in the light. "This station is now under new ownership," Jack continued, his voice steady and unrelenting. "Anyone involved in the slave trade has 2 options: surrender or die." He switched the feed to show the bodies of the slavers they had already taken down, followed by the terrified, bound market leaders that had already been captured. "This is what happens when you trade in human lives," he said coldly. The transmission cut out. Jack turned to Garrick. "Let's make sure they never use this place again." Garrick grinned. "I was hoping you'd say that." Explosions rocked the station as Jack and his crew set off a series of pre-planted charges. The once thriving black market was now a war zone, smoke and fire consuming the corridors. The criminals who had profited from suffering now found themselves on the receiving end of it. Jack led his team back toward the ship, his mind already calculating the next steps. He had enough data to track down more slaver operations, enough weapons to start a real war against them. As they reached the docking bay, a final obstacle stood in their path. A warlord. The man was massive, his cybernetic arms covered in heavy plating, his face a mess of scars and metal implants. He stood flanked by a handful of mercenaries, all of them armed and ready. "You have no idea what you've just done," the warlord growled. "This station was just one piece of an empire. You think you can stop the slave trade? You're one man. Jack tilted his head slightly, considering the statement. Then he shot the warlord in the knee. The massive man collapsed with a roar of pain. Jack stepped closer, pressing his boot against the warlord's chest, pinning him down. You're right, Jack said. I'm one man. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. But now the whole galaxy knows I'm coming. With that, he pulled the trigger. The Reaper had just begun his war. Jack Carter sat in the pilot's seat of the stolen slaver ship, watching the black market station shrink in the distance. Fires raged across its hull, secondary explosions lighting up the void. The warlord was dead, his men scattered or burning with the wreckage. It wasn't enough. Jack had seen the files, the transaction records, the long list of buyers and suppliers. The market wasn't just a single operation, it was a network. A supply chain that stretched across the galaxy, feeding on the weak, trading lives like currency. And he was going to burn it all down. Garrick dropped into the co-pilot's seat, kicking his boots up on the console like he belonged there. So, where to next? Jack didn't answer right away. He was staring at a set of coordinates on the screen, a location pulled from the slaver's database. A name he hadn't seen in years. An old friend. Jack exhaled slowly. We make a stop first. Then we go to war. Garrick smirked. Now you're talking. The ship's thrusters flared, and they disappeared into the stars. The hidden outpost was buried in the shadow of a dead moon, a small, unregistered station that didn't officially exist. It had no beacon, no signal, no reason for anyone to find it, unless they already knew where to look. Jack knew. As soon as the ship docked, he stepped off alone, leaving Garrick and the others behind. This was personal. The outpost doors slid open with a hiss, and Jack stepped into a dimly lit corridor. A single camera swiveled toward him, scanning his face. A voice crackled over the intercom. Well, well? Thought you were dead. Jack smirked. Not yet. The doors ahead unlocked, and he walked into a makeshift command center filled with weapons, maps, and men who moved like soldiers, even in their casual postures. At the center of it all stood Commander Nathan Briggs, his gray-streaked beard doing nothing to hide the sharpness in his eyes. Reaper, Briggs said, folding his arms. What the hell are you doing here? Jack tossed the datapad onto the table. Slavers. A network bigger than we thought. Briggs glanced at the files, then at Jack. And you want my help? Jack shook his head. I want a war. Briggs was silent for a long moment, then he exhaled, shaking his head with a low chuckle. You always did have a flair for the dramatic. He turned to one of his men. Get the team prepped. Looks like we're back in business. Jack stood on the bridge of a news ship, one built for war. The crew around him wasn't just a handful of freed prisoners anymore, it was a strike force. Former operatives, special forces, bounty hunters who had once worked in the shadows. Now they had a purpose. Their target, the heart of the slaver syndicate. The Valkyrie homeworld. The reptilian slavers had been the backbone of the operation, their government turning a blind eye as long as the credits kept flowing. Jack wasn't interested in politics. He was interested in ending them. The plan was simple. Hit their fleet first, cripple their defenses, and then take the fight to the surface. Jack's hands tightened around the controls. He could see the Valkyrie ships on the long-range scanners, moving lazily through their patrol routes. They weren't ready. He activated the comms. All teams, get ready. The ship lurched forward, weapons charging. The war had begun. The battle was brutal. Jack's forces tore through the Valkyrie fleet with ruthless efficiency. The slavers had been prepared for small skirmishes, pirate attacks, not a coordinated military assault. Jack piloted his fighter through the chaos, dodging plasma fire and returning shots with pinpoint accuracy. Every explosion, every falling ship, was another step toward eradicating their empire. Garrick's voice crackled over the comms. They're breaking! We push now, we take the capital! Jack angled his ship toward the surface. Then let's finish this. They hit the planet hard, landing in the heart of the slaver stronghold. Jack moved through the battlefield like a force of nature. Valkyrie soldiers fell before they even realized they were being hunted. His team swept through their command centers, disabling communications, cutting off their leaders. The capital burned. The Valkyrie homeworld, once untouchable, was now a graveyard. Jack stood in the ruins of their central palace, watching the last of their government officials dragged away in chains. He should have felt satisfied. But it wasn't over. Not yet. The name, Reaper, spread across the galaxy like wildfire. The slaver syndicates collapsed. Buyers abandoned their holdings. Black markets shut down overnight, terrified that Jack Carter would come knocking. The legend grew. Some said he was a ghost, an unstoppable force of vengeance. Others whispered that he was just the beginning, that there were more like him waiting in the shadows. Jack Carter disappeared. His name remained. And the Reaper's war never truly ended.